Good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to the OAG November webinar, and thanks for joining us for the next hour or so. I'm Becca Rowland and I'll be hosting today's webinar. Today we're going to be giving you an update on the state of the aviation industry worldwide, drawing on OAG data as we always do, but we're also going to be taking a little bit more of a look at the impact and implications for tourism and hospitality. As we tend to take an Asia Pacific slant in this morning webinar, certainly morning in the UK here, I'm delighted that today we're going to be joined by Hannah Pearson, who's a founding partner of Per Anderson, a tourism research and sales representation consultancy specialising in Southeast Asian and Muslim tourism industry. Thank you for joining us, Hannah.
Thank you for having me.
And we've got, as always, John Grant with us from OAG, who can always help us understand the numbers and give an opinion on what they mean. Thanks for joining us, John.
Hi, good morning, Becca.
As usual, the format for the webinar will be that we'll run through some slides and try and leave some time for your questions at the end. But do send your questions in as we go, and we'll try and answer questions if we can as we're going through, rather than just leave them to the end, so that we can address them when we're talking about that particular topic. So let's make a start. And what we're going to be looking at today is updating the position on frequency capacity in the industry. We're going to be looking a little bit at recovery in air travel and how we're going to see passengers changing where their preferences are, where they want to fly. And what does this mean for the tourism sector? Are they going to have to focus particularly on local and regional markets a bit more? I think we know the answer to that, but we'll be going into that in rather more detail. We always start with this information, which comes from OAG's Schedules Analyzer, looking at how capacity is changing this time, this week versus the same week last year, and month by month through the year, so we can track it. John, let's come to you first. This is a slide we've seen many times before, but we've updated it now to 2nd November. I don't think when we started doing this in March, we anticipated we'd still be showing something like this quite so long ago. But are we seeing anything new here, or it feels to me like we're just ticking over, really? There's nothing happening that's causing any specific change one way or another in really any market.
Well, there wasn't until Saturday evening in the United Kingdom, Becca, but as always, the devil is in the detail, and there are elements of churn and change that are occurring on a week-on-week basis. And I think it is important to note that this table is before the planned lockdown of international air travel in the United Kingdom, which should come in effect from Thursday, and that will equate to about 700,000 outbound seats from the United Kingdom. So that's a lot of potential capacity that's about to come out. But it is a really strange week, the 2nd of November. If we compare it to the same week last year, and indeed look at particular markets in North America, despite the absence of the CARES Act, which has now disappeared, or at least it has at this moment in time, both American and Southwest were adding back considerable amounts of capacity last week. 10% in the case of American on their domestic network. And at the same time, notwithstanding the UK lockdown, we're seeing Europe fall back as well quite significantly, with both Ryanair and EasyJet and indeed Wizz Air cutting capacity. And yesterday, I think Wizz Air announced their October load factor was 66%, which for a low-cost airline with a large network such as theirs is not going to make pleasant reading on the balance sheet. And it's also, I think, a precursor to what we're really going to be discussing about travel and tourism, and particularly the first quarter of 2021 and the Northern Hemisphere winter ski season. Just looks like it's not going to materialise. You know, the traditional Saturday 6 o'clock departures from airports, with people their skis is just you can't see it occurring this year. It's just not there, and that's frustrating. We're just stuck. And if you look at the bottom at the chart and you see the black dotted line, you can see how Europe has, in the last couple of weeks, been following a steady decline since about the 14th, probably the 31st of August. And apart from last week's half-term holidays, that trend is continuing on. So it looks like we are staying flat. You know, Latin America has improved considerably, but that is because they're just coming out of spike 1 of COVID-19. Peru opened international services this week, as did Argentina. And you've got to think if COVID-19 follows the same pattern as we've been seeing, then they will end up probably in a second lockdown at some point in early January. So yeah, there's a lot going on underneath the headline.
I mean, yeah, obviously in the UK, which is where I am, we go into lockdown again tomorrow for a month. But you know, across Europe, we're seeing more and more restrictions, aren't we? It's this second wave that's really running through the northern hemisphere, I guess. And I saw reports this week that maybe cases are picking up in China again. So I know that we anticipate this European the capacity really falling as a result of the lockdowns inevitably, but actually we might see that in North America, might we, or in China again? You sound quite bullish about North America, that you're not expecting to see that.
Well, very hard to be bullish about anything when you're seeing the current news coming through on various websites. But you know, there are optimistic signs. Vaccines are getting closer in some parts of the world. There's talk of distribution of vaccines to key and essential workers even before Christmas in some countries. So you know, come the first quarter of next year, and particularly in the tourism and leisure market, I think in North America, with the very severe and dark and cold winters, the traditional snowbird domestic market is still going to be there, because the freedom to travel domestically has always been within the United States through COVID-19. So there are some optimistic signs, and that's perhaps what the US airlines are seeing in their forward bookings, the fact that there is demand for the first quarter and they're trying to stimulate more.
Yeah, but as you know, as we've got to focus on tourism and hospitality today, I'm with you with the ski market. Every day I'm getting emails popping in my in tray offering me ways to ensure my ski trip or make it safe or allow me to back out. But I certainly at a personal level, it's hard to imagine booking a ski trip from the UK into continental Europe.
Yeah, and of course, in Europe, just to answer one of the questions we've already had, from Nicholas, EU government silence and lack of support to aviation. What is being done about it? Well, the answer, Nicholas, is absolutely nothing. It's no serious lobbying or effective lobbying has taken place from what I can see so far. We are where we are.
Yeah. So moving on, we've the point you make about North America, and I guess China's the same. They're what we've talked about before, large domestic markets, so they're not as prone to the sort of restrictions we see, especially in Europe, where so much of the travel is international. Our next slide, we've taken a look at what were the top, some of the top international country pairs around the world last year in terms of capacity. This is, and we've grouped them by sort of broad global regions. So I know we have a more Asian audience for today, so the top group are those top country pairs in Asia, so China, Thailand being the largest international country pair for capacity in that part of the world, which is at the top and is ranked 6th globally. So we've shown a heat map like this before, but just for countries before. This time we've just taken out the international country pair data, and you can see how different country pairs are faring. And the range of red in that top group shows really that these are markets that are much more locked down actually than in Europe. We tend to think of Europe as being, you know, very international, very restricted in terms of travel, and certainly at the moment that's the way we're thinking of it. But in terms of the actual restrictions in place, there are more in that Asian part of the world, aren't there?
There are, and you know, Hannah, I'm sure, is going to shed some light on some of these, but I think it's very easy to forget how important Chinese outbound travel is, and particularly leisure travel and touristic travel, and even more so in what is traditionally the Northern Hemisphere winter season. And, you know, huge markets like China, Thailand, China, Japan, China, Hong Kong, China, Taiwan are essentially closed. And that is really, really difficult and damaging for the tourism market in these countries. And and China really does hold the key to a lot of the re-emergence of the aviation industry in Southeast and Northeast Asia, because until outbound travel is relaxed and more leisure travel takes place, and you know, we're in a situation where nothing is going to move, Becca. It is stuck. It is firmly locked down, and that's particularly frustrating for hoteliers and anyone in the tourism industry, because, you know, the Chinese market is the largest outbound market in the world today.
Yeah, and we will bring Hannah in, but I'm going to bring her in a little bit later so that she can speak to some slides that are a bit more specific. But absolutely, Hannah's got lots of expertise in this area, and has been, I know in her podcast she's been talking about the travel corridors or the bubbles or the green lanes or whatever we want to call them, and how countries are or are not facilitating that sort of travel. I should just point out the two columns at the right of the slide, November and December, we've separated a bit because obviously that's capacity that is scheduled but hasn't necessarily flown yet. And some of those numbers look rather more positive than we expect to be delivered by the market. So UK, Spain, for instance, we see in December. At the moment, the schedule seems to show that there's only a 40% reduction versus last year, but that doesn't seem feasible, does it, John?
It doesn't, Becca, and I think this is a frustration for any hotelier, any tour operator, any ground package, you know, facilitator in any country in the world. Airlines are loading far more capacity, or are keeping far more seats in their reservation systems than they are likely to sell. We saw this in the summer, and we're seeing it reappear in the winter. And you know, the data shows that up to a third of that capacity is being taken out at very short notice, and that is just, from a planning perspective, so frustrating for everyone else in the travel ecosystem, because you don't know what is going to be operated and you don't know what isn't going to be operated, and consumer confidence is being frustrated. You know, the last thing anyone wants to do leading up to Christmas is buy an air ticket and then find out that they're going to have to get a travel voucher, which is actually what's happened in the United Kingdom with the sudden imposition of a lockdown. Airlines are saying you can have a voucher, but you can't have a refund, and you can change the date. So, you know, and it's not fair on the airlines either. You know, they're stretched in terms of resources, and they're having to respond to badly thought through decisions. And the implication falls back on the traveller. So yeah, we should expect to see quite a bit of this capacity in some of those major markets coming.
And I think we've talked before, haven't we? That level of uncertainty for the traveller just really doesn't help the situation, doesn't it? I mean, what people increasingly will be so hesitant to book travel if they don't feel that there's some sort of certainty around it.
Hesitant to book travel, not just for Christmas and the New Year, but also going into the first half of next year. I think we need to sort this out.
So in terms of capacity coming out, we show this slide on a regular basis, I think now, which just looks at a snapshot of where the schedule was right through to the end of the year at various points in time. So the grey line is what the schedule was last year, so capacity globally, and then this thin yellow line was what it looked like to the end of the year at the 20th of July, and then similar point, 22nd of actually we've got them slightly Yeah, so 20th of April is this one. The list on the right is in a strange order, all the way through to this dark, thick yellow line being the most recent schedule. So we can see that as the weeks go by, the airlines just take capacity out. And our expectation, John, would you like to say that this dotted line might be where we end up for the rest of the year? That's a continuation of the trend?
With what we know today, all things being equal, there's no reason to see any uptick in those numbers. So if we're at 55 million today, we're going to lose, that's 55 million seats per week. We're going to lose another couple of million by the end of this week because of the UK lockdown and other actions from airlines. We're going to be down at probably 51, maybe 50 million seats a week at the end of December, which is going to be less than half of what was operated in 2019, Becca. So, you know, all those hopes for a recovery, I'm afraid, are just evaporating in front of our eyes.
Yeah, yeah. And so let's have just mention the airlines briefly. Since we last did a webinar a month ago, we've seen a number of the third quarter earnings results from airlines. Not every airline's reported yet, and obviously some are state-owned and we don't get the data and so on. But of the ones I'm seeing so far, China Southern is the only one that reports a positive result, and some really stunning, spectacular losses here in the third quarter.
Yeah, the daily burn rate, so the amount of money being just spent per day for some of these airlines, you know, they're proudly proclaiming they've moved it down from $45 million to $30 million or whatever it happens.
Yes, I've seen that. A boast of only losing 20 million a day is something else.
Something to be proud of, I guess. Let me try and help you lose some more. But you know, the third quarter is traditionally one of the strongest quarters of the year. Good mix of leisure and in the last month, business traffic. So, you know, those are very, very concerning numbers. And I think the China Southern one is really interesting because in that third quarter of this year, they have operated less than 1% of their seats on international services. So that profit, and you know, clearly, as with any profit, the devil is in the detail, and getting hold of the report would be interesting. But if they are managing to be profitable on a domestic network, and clearly it's probably not of a size or the scale that they would want it to be on a regular basis, it brings into question the whole network structure of all of the Chinese carriers and their desire to fly internationally, and particularly internationally long haul, which we know has been, you know, not very successful for many of the Chinese airlines. And from a tourism perspective, what does that mean? Well, it means, you know, if tourism does come back, it's going to be much more regional. Those European markets that have got tier 2 Chinese airline services will have to work very hard to keep them. And you know, their stakeholders that are around the airport and communities will need to help the airport keep those services if they want them. So yeah, it's worrying times indeed.
John, back in May, June, we were saying, you know, what happens if traffic can't recover for the summer? What happens if the airlines can't replenish their cash reserves? And you know, the worst in a sense has happened. What happens now? We look at these big 3 American airlines or 4 American airlines, which, you know, frankly accounted for most of the global profit in aviation last year. They've lost a huge amount. The CARES Act now has come to an end. What happens going forward for the airlines? How do they fund the next 6 months?
Well, that's a very good question, and there's probably lots of discussions taking place between CFOs at the respective airlines and their investors. It's tough times indeed. I mean, you know, the long-term prognosis for the aviation industry remains pretty good. Forward bookings for quite a few large airlines in May and June of next year relative to previous years look pretty good because people have kept those bookings and just rolled them over 12 months. But getting through the next 5 months is going to be a challenge for all of these carriers. You can't. We've seen airlines doing some very creative things. Some working unions, pilots, I think in Delta have all accepted a different working agreement so that they can keep themselves and their colleagues all flying rather than seeing furloughs. So airlines are looking at this in different ways and trying to do different things. And it doesn't even really probably cover its cost, but we're now seeing scenic flights, aren't we, in Southeast Asia, and even restaurants on an A380 in Singapore for a period of time. So airlines are being creative, but 761 airlines filed services this week. I would not be surprised if by the end of February or beginning of March we're down to 730, because there are some that are going to find it really hard in the next couple of months.
So before we move on to look more in detail at tourism, one thing we wanted to have a quick look at this week, we had a question ourselves whether the level of state support for some carriers would distort the amount of capacity they chose to put back in the market. As I guess, frankly, are they not taking the drastic measures we might expect because they've got a bit of a buffer there? So this chart shows, it's a dot for each airline that we sort of started off trying to look at the top 50 airlines, but we didn't get as far as looking at the data for every single one. Those below the line are those that are offering less capacity in the winter schedule at the moment than they did last winter. And we wanted to see whether those with the yellow ones who didn't have state support actually were more positive in their capacity, but we're not really seeing any impact here. Maybe there's not enough data points, John, but do you have a sense that there's any difference in strategy or thinking in those airlines that have, the Lufthansas and Air France's, KLMs that have received it?
I think it's quite interesting, Becca. The top right-hand cluster is actually the four major US airlines, so United, Delta, American, and the Southwestern. Who have all benefited from the CARES Act, or at least been able to avail themselves of support if they wanted it. And they have cut back capacity a bit. But if you was to split this by domestic and international, then actually, in terms of domestic capacity, they're all pretty similar to what they have been in the past. And the next cluster on the left-hand side of the line is the big three Chinese airlines who've essentially got more capacity at this moment in time than they had last year by virtue of switching to domestic services. Rather than setting a 777 off on a 12-hour sector, they're using wide-bodied flights for 2-hour sectors, and they're getting more productivity and more seats out of those particular aircraft types. But you can see most airlines have shaved some degree of capacity off, and what we're seeing actually is many airlines probably using about 75 or even 80% of their total fleet, and producing around 55%, 60% of their capacity. So essentially, they're not working their aircraft as hard as they were in the past. Average utilization is down by about 30%. So the good news is, at the end of that, and you follow the conclusion through, Becca, if you do book a flight and your flight is one of those that does operate, the likelihood is it's going to be on time because there's not so much pressure on the airline's scheduling network.
And you're going to have an empty seat next to you.
You have an empty seat next to you.
Okay, let's move on to look at travel and tourism. This is some data from the World Travel and Tourism Council, which I like to look at every now and then, where they do some analysis to look at travel and tourism as a proportion of the GDP for a particular country. And globally, what this shows us is that it accounts for about 10.3%. Some countries it's more. Cambodia, it's up at 26.4%. Thailand, 19.7%. And then down a bit lower, Japan, 7%, Vietnam, 8.8%. So I picked out some of the key markets in Asia Pacific. Hannah, let's bring you in here. This looks about right, doesn't it? This gels.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, absolutely. And I think then it also links quite nicely also to the the impact that some of these countries have had in terms of job losses for tourism workers. So Thailand, I think right now they're predicting there might be 10 million tourism workers unemployed by the end of the year. It could be rising to 14 million. Cambodia is about 110,000 tourism workers who have lost jobs. Philippines, 4.8 million. So this, the lack of tourism that has been going on in these countries since March, pretty much, both inbound and domestically, is having a huge impact on tourism workers and the industry in general.
Yeah. So you put these numbers together for us. A lot of restrictions in Asia. Are you seeing really that it's almost impossible to travel around the region internationally?
Definitely, yeah. I think this is a key difference between Southeast Asia and Europe right now, is that there is very much an unwillingness to reopen to either one another, and all of these countries are in the ASEAN, Asia and Southeast Asian Southeast Asian kind of governmental organization, and there's still this unwillingness within that group to open up to one another. In fact, the only ASEAN countries which have Malaysia and Singapore. The rest are all very firmly closed. And to some degree, you can almost say that sometimes they're a victim of their own success. That's what some people are saying. So you look at the case numbers, and these are the total case numbers in the year, and you compare some of these to Europe. Again, it's barely anything. Thailand, 3,784 as of last Sunday. But that means that now these countries are even more unwilling to reopen, because they're seeing these second waves, third waves in other countries, and they don't want that to happen. And the locals are also really afraid of opening up the country to inbound tourism, and that fear of bringing in the virus again and having to have all of these lockdown restrictions again.
But Hannah, if you go back to the previous slide where we look at GDP and how important these countries are going to starve themselves to economic poverty, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
And relative to the number of, every death is a tragedy. But and not to belittle that, compare that to other parts of the world. These countries don't seem to have had many cases, and I can understand the lockdown, but it is just short-term expediency, surely.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think the politicians they were trying to balance this, do people die from the virus, or do people die from poverty, from not having a livelihood? Indonesia took the decision that they had a less strict lockdown than many other countries, and you can see accordingly their cases are that much higher. But yes, if these countries don't open up to tourism soon, they're going to really suffer. I think that right now,
how much tourism is there between some of these countries? I mean, I look at these, the deaths, 0 in Cambodia, 0 in Laos, 28 in Singapore, 59 in Thailand. If these countries with low numbers opened up for travel between themselves, how much of the tourism market is between those countries, or really is tourism about people coming in from outside the region?
There is a lot of intra-ASEAN travel, certainly. So, if you look at, say, Singapore, I think Indonesia is the second biggest market for Singapore. Malaysia and Singapore, again, are top markets for one another. I think Vietnam and Thailand are pretty high up there for Cambodia. But the big driving market, and John was saying this earlier, is China. China is really one of the biggest markets for all of these, and I think we'll talk about them in a little bit more depth a bit later.
Okay.
But I think what is also interesting, to that point, if you are at Singapore Changi on a Friday evening and you see the number of people who are leaving Singapore for a weekend break on a low-cost airline to one of these regional countries, it just highlights that there is a lot of tourism demand that is just going to be lost. And certainly for the longer haul traveller, as long as these regional markets are closed down between themselves, it just makes it even harder for people to think about these destinations as potential holiday points.
Yeah, definitely.
So we've got a bit of information here that you've provided, Hannah, about domestic travel
Yeah.
What are we seeing here? That there is domestic travel here from most of these countries?
Yeah, so there is domestic travel, but if you look at a country like the Philippines, this is a really interesting one because only very, very recently, say the 1st of October, has Boracay Island, and this is, you know, the top tourism destination really within the Philippines, has that actually opened up to the entire country. So they locked down, I think, mid-March, like many other countries in Southeast Asia, and only now are they now permitting people from other parts of the Philippines even to fly in to Boracay Island. So they have been really, really restrictive in terms of where they can fly. And even now, you know, all the countries basically opened up to some degree of domestic tourism in June. But of course, we're seeing a third wave here in Malaysia. So domestic travel is now not permitted out from KL, from the capital, which is of course the major source market for many other states within Malaysia. Myanmar, they had their second wave, so domestic tourism into flights, you know, interregional flights were stopped on the 11th of September. It's really a kind of stop, start, stop, start. And some countries are doing much better than others. Vietnam, I think, is doing very well in terms of recovering that domestic tourism. But others like Thailand are still really struggling. So Thailand have even been running a domestic tourism stimulus scheme. I think it started in June. In theory, they could have 5 million room nights that would be subsidized by the government. And to date, they've only had 1.9 million. And the same for air tickets. There's an opportunity to have 2 million air tickets, which are subsidized by the government, and only 100,000 are booked. So whether it's that the government hasn't quite got the domestic stimulus right, whether the mechanism is too complicated, or just whether people are just very unwilling to travel domestically, it is a long way to recover in Thailand.
So we've had a question from Brian Chan saying Boracay Island requires a negative test and Bohol may open soon.
Yeah.
Palawan Island is the same. What role does the testing play in encouraging people to travel or not travel? Is that a real impediment, the process of getting tested?
Yeah, I think so, especially in the Philippines. So a lot of the provincial travel at the moment requires an RT-PCR test, and these are pretty expensive to procure. They're quite difficult to get scheduled, and a lot of tourism owners are now petitioning the government whether they can switch to an antigen testing instead, which of course is a lot faster, is a lot cheaper. But you know, if you then compare that to Indonesia with Bali reopened and they had the same requirement. You had to have a negative test on arrival, but it only needs to be an antigen test, not the RT-PCR. And they saw a spike in cases. So, you know, especially these two countries where they do have a high number of cases, Indonesia and the Philippines, and they are islands, it's difficult. But definitely these tests are not helping tourism businesses to reopen. And in fact, I think the Department of Tourism in the Philippines is trying to set a ceiling limit on the price of testing just to make it more affordable for travelers to be able to go.
So I know we bemoan the lack of sort of intergovernmental coordination in Europe and elsewhere over these matters, but it seems like, you know, testing is just quite complex. It would be lovely to have a single set of tests that everybody agreed on and a single process and agreement, you know, about prices and so on. But actually, if some of the tests, you know, are in place and there's still increases in cases as, you know, as a result of more tourism, it's going to make governments very nervous, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Let's move on and have a look. You've got a couple of slides. You've given us some information here. This is travel agreements, isn't it? And I mean, really, plenty of what we call bubbles, corridors, yeah. Green lanes. Tell us a bit about what is being done to try and facilitate travel in this way in Southeast Asia.
Sure. So like you say, travel agreements, travel bubbles, travel corridors, there's so many different names for it around Southeast Asia, even in Singapore itself. And I would say there are some agreements in place, but these are all extremely, extremely limited. So it is predominantly for business travel, essential business travel. It's for official travel purposes. And they have not really had much of an impact on arrivals. And we'll show you the arrivals numbers in just a moment. The only kind of positive one that we are seeing something might come out of is with Singapore, who have now negotiated what they call an air travel bubble with Hong Kong. And this air travel bubble would essentially include leisure travel, which would be the first kind of bubble within Southeast Asia to actually do so. And travelers wouldn't need to quarantine on arrival, they would just need to be tested on arrival. And it's slated to open late November, both sides have been saying, but we're still waiting for the details, and there's still going to be quotas, the Singapore government have said. So in terms of the availability, the capacity that it's going to add, it's going to be very limited, I think.
These just, I know you're going to share your numbers. These are just pieces of political expediency, aren't they? I mean, you announce these things on the 8th of June, and on the 3rd and 4th of November, there is still no change in what's happened. In many cases, there is little or no progress being made, and it captures a couple of headlines. The tourism industry gets excited and thinks something's going to happen, and then it just all goes flat again.
Yeah, it's certainly, I mean, if you look at who is negotiating, which countries are negotiating with one another, it tends to be the top trading partners. And there's definitely a political play in here, kind of competition between China and Japan within Southeast Asia. And we've seen both of them go on tours with their foreign ministers, or their prime ministers, even with Japan, around these countries. So in terms of these travel agreements, you can see China popping up a lot, Japan popping up a lot as well. You're right, a lot of it is very, very political. And we were looking at Singapore and whether these travel bubbles really had any impact on arrival numbers. Maybe you can show that slide.
We've got some numbers of our own, Hannah, which
you showed this.
John, you were showing me these numbers yesterday.
I'm just getting frustrated, I guess, at all of these attempts at creating a positive story, and we're not actually seeing any real evidence of it, and it needs people to come clean, I think. And if you're going to put a travel or a corridor in, then put it in and make it work. But these are the
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, these are the flights from Singapore, the frequency of flights from Singapore to those countries with which they have created travel agreements, going back as far as the last week of June this year through to the first week of December. And you can see that in many cases, there's been little or no change in the number of scheduled flights that were being operated. So what's changed, guys?
But I think, John, if you have an agreement that allows for just business travel, for instance, I mean, business travel might be a fairly significant part of travel, but it's not all the plane, is it? It's not. Business travellers alone are not enough to
absolutely not.
To make an airline want to put more flights on.
But the sound bites are all about these are travel agreements to open up the market again. And when sometimes, and it is that horrible phrase, the devil is in the detail. Sometimes it is, as you say, government ministers, or as we've seen in Indonesia in the past, you need to have a particular permit from your employer saying that you need to travel for business reasons, etc., etc. And all of those processes are exactly the same as trying to get a COVID test. They add bureaucracy, administration, and cost, to the travel process. And all of that to suddenly find out your flight could be cancelled anyway. Who wants to do it? We've got to simplify anything. And there's a question here already about governments accepting other governments' PCP testings and protocols and all of those sort of things. It's you know, unless we get this sorted out, you know, we're not going to have a breakthrough moment.
I think we've got Hannah's chart next, which shows the same point very, very eloquently, doesn't it, Hannah?
Yeah, it's taking John's data, I guess, and seeing it through a different lens. So I just had a quick look because Singapore released its September arrival numbers just on Monday to see, you know, after these travel agreements have been implemented, did it make any impact on international arrivals? You can see the first one is China. So this is the oldest agreement, I suppose, that they have had in place with them. It's only got up to 2,419 by September, you know, and such little numbers compared to the 250.
Goodness.
Yeah, my goodness. Even if you look at Malaysia, and now of course there's so, you know, Malaysia, Singapore is, I think, one of the busiest air routes, you know, between KL and Singapore, one of the busiest air routes in the world. You know, it's dropped down 480 in September, and in fact the numbers actually decreased after they implemented this travel agreement in August. Now, in theory, actually they should be allowed 400 arrivals between Malaysia and Singapore on a weekly basis. But, you know, it's 480 in September, so that's well below what they would actually be allowed to do.
That 400 you mentioned, Hannah, is 400 flights a week, isn't it?
I think it's 400 packs.
Packs.
400 packs. Yeah, 400 packs a week. So I mean, that number in itself is limited, but considering they only got to 480 by air in September, they're nowhere near that limit.
Okay, and we've got this is the same data for Korea and Japanese arrivals into Singapore. Really no discernible impact at all. Is there effectively nobody's traveling to Singapore?
No one.
Go on, Hannah.
No, I was just going to say no one is going, and you can see actually the numbers in September have actually decreased since the travel agreements were implemented.
And let's not forget, a large part of Singapore's tourism economy is based on stopover international traffic, routing from Europe to Southeast Asia and down into Australasia, and that's not there either because, you know, of the quarantine requirements and just the frequency of flights at this moment in time. So the tourism industry in Singapore, I mean, it must have been shot to pieces by now. And I know they've got, you know, great plans for tourism recovery, and I've listened to some of the processes they've put in place around controlling COVID-19, but it must be so frustrating to be a hotelier or a ground tour operator in these markets at the moment, because the market at this time of year would really be picking up for the winter season and everyone escaping the Northern Hemisphere.
Yeah, I mean, I went on a sales call to Singapore in February, the beginning of February, and already then I was meeting travel agents. The travel agents were already half empty. They'd already put their staff on unpaid leave in February, and we're still in November, and they've not reopened. You know, how much domestic travel can keep them going? People are just going to be booking directly. So it's just a good job.
I've heard anecdotally of Singapore Airlines cabin staff, you know, who've been assisting other public services such as the underground and the metro and transport systems by helping people and information desk. But that's unsustainable as well. You know, it's just, we need to find a way through this, and pretty quickly.
So these agreements that we're talking about are typically bilateral. We've had a question from Michelle. Is there any value for Singapore in unilaterally opening its borders to some countries? Is the answer to be more unilateral and not to go through these convoluted bilateral agreements?
Yeah, well, that will be interesting because they have now done this. So in theory, they have opened up the country to Vietnam, to Australia, to New Zealand, and to China, I think from it's either today or the 6th of November. But you're still limited because those countries still can't travel out to you. I think the only value in these unilateral ones is perhaps looking at those countries which are also, I suppose, which don't have so many restrictions on letting their travelers out and not specifying it. I mean, I know that the Singapore government are saying that this is kind of an open gesture and we want to welcome other countries to have these agreements with us. But I think a lot of it is about headlines, and a lot of it is just about wanting to be seen as the innovative country in ASEAN who is leading the way, but it's not really achieving a lot.
And to what extent is the industry, the tourism industry within some of these countries, lobbying for change? Have they got other ideas of how they can make this work that are not being listened to, or have they not even been able to come together to try and put forward solutions?
Yeah, I would say each country individually, they might have their own travel associations, but no one really seems to have all got together in one block and lobbied the government. So, for example, there's not all of the Southeast Asian airlines have banded together and are talking to the governments to open up the borders. That just hasn't happened. So it's a lot of individuals shouting, and of course, when you do that, there's not a big impact.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's move on and talk a little bit about China. We mentioned this earlier. Obviously, China is really important. The last few years, we at MIDAS have been talking a lot about the importance of the Chinese outbound market. With some there were some staggering numbers for the sort of proportion of international visitors we should expect to be Chinese. Was it 1 in 4, John? We were saying by 2030, and who knows where we end up now? But China's clearly been really important as a source market for these Southeast Asian countries. Do you want to say a bit about that, Hannah, or John? John, you were going to say something.
Hannah, after you.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I took a look at 2010 Chinese arrivals versus 2019, and you can just see that it has just shot up. Countries like Cambodia, it's at 36%. Thailand is 28%. So you can see now why all of these countries are so keen to get these travel agreements in place with China, I guess in the hope that once you've opened up business travel, eventually that's going to lead on to leisure travel. The only country that has really had any, I can't really call it success, that has had some arrivals from China is Thailand, who've implemented this special tourist visa scheme, which is very, very restricted. Tourists still have to undergo a 14-day quarantine. They have to pay quite a high price for the visa. They have to have very high levels of medical insurance. And they've only had 184 Chinese tourists come. They made a big fanfare about this. And they've had 2 groups, 184. So so you can see from that that's really limited. And I think the industry itself is pretty critical, because how far can 184 tourists worth of revenue go? You know, you've got a whole country.
Not very far, does it? And I think one of the other things to factor into all of this is a lot of countries, hotels, tourism boards, and ground tour operators, etc., have invested considerable amounts of money in developing bespoke Chinese products, haven't they? You know, and the Chinese traveller has some very unique travel requirements, and you know, rightly so. It wants to feel that it's being respected and that they're being treated as valued customers. So, you know, they've invested in all sorts of things that cater to the Chinese traveller. And for 184 passengers, you don't get much of a return on that, do you?
No, absolutely not. And you look at Cambodia, where Sihanoukville has pretty much been developed to cater for Cambodian tourists, and there's to cater for Chinese tourists, sorry, and there's barely any, very, very few arrivals. Just it's like a ghost town.
So
just the whole region.
John, earlier we were saying, you know, at the beginning of this webinar, we were talking about the Chinese airlines and how they seem to be doing pretty well off the domestic market. And we know traditionally they haven't made a lot of money with their European expansion and those long haul routes. Yeah. So, you know, is there a question mark about whether the Chinese market does come back? Obviously, there's been huge demand from Chinese people to travel outbound, and that's been encouraged by the government. But then, you know, last week they had their latest sort of 5-year plan meeting, and there does seem to be more of a refocus on the domestic economy coming out of that? Will we see them not encouraging international travel?
No, I think you know, there will be a push of international travel, but it will be much more regional in nature than it had sort of been shaping up. It's from, you know, the Chinese traveler and the Chinese individual is now, you know, a valuable member of the global community who has a disposable income and wants to travel and experience international destinations, be they for, you know, a beach holiday or a city break type sort of holiday. So I can certainly see that the volumes could come back really, really quickly in Southeast Asia once China has accepted and allows people both out and back in. But, you know, the doubt becomes, I think, for anything that's more than perhaps a 4 or 5 hour flying length or distance from China, because we know that those routes are not profitable for many of these airlines. And if you could fly a 777 twice daily from Beijing to Vietnam or Thailand, for example, and you can fill it with a 90% load factor, and as I say, you can do it twice daily, or you fly a once daily service to a European airport with a 45 or 50% load factor, which one's going to make you more money?
Yeah, good questions. Okay, we've got a few minutes left. Let's try and move to some of our questions that have come in, if that's okay. Hannah, we had a question from Nicholas Gorman asking, when you're talking about Thailand and the offer for the 2 million tickets, whether the protests in Thailand actually affected that, or is there less appetite for domestic travel because of that? And also, are Thais more financially distressed? And I guess that's a question across the whole region. At what point will we see just the loss of disposable incomes affecting travel as well?
Yeah, I mean, certainly a loss of disposable income is going to be a major factor in whether people are choosing to go on holiday within Southeast Asia. And yes, I think that probably is having an impact in Thailand. The protests, I think that they have had some impact on holidays to Bangkok in particular. But I think that it has not had such a huge impact yet, or at least the media has not reported that it has. But definitely, you know, the GDP is predicted to decline, I think, in nearly all countries in Southeast Asia, except I think Myanmar and Vietnam. People have lost jobs, people have taken pay cuts. And like you say, there's that fear factor as well. If you want to get on a plane, even if it's just a short journey, they might think twice about that. They might just prefer to take a road trip or go visit family and friends, in which case you're not going to see so much income going back into the tourism industry.
And I guess that the GDP expectations I've seen for next year do show Chinese GDP still growing, so as it has this year. So actually that points to continue sort of looking to China to try and help everywhere, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and across Southeast Asia as well, generally the GDP is forecast to bounce back. But of course, that's if there's no second wave or third wave. And then who knows what will happen then.
Yeah.
China really,
John, go ahead.
Yeah, China really does hold the key, doesn't it, Becca?
I think it does. I think it does. We've got a question from Tony, who's coming from Africa. So this is quite taking us away from travel and tourism a bit, or away from the tourism question, away from Asia. But he's asking about the big hub carriers, the Qatars, the Etihads, Turkish, Ethiopian. You know, they've tended, or they've tried to retain their global networks perhaps more than some of the long-haul legacy carriers. He's asked us if we've got a slide to illustrate that, or we haven't. I'm sorry, Tony. But John, I wondered if you wanted to comment on what we're seeing currently in terms of the strategy of those big network carriers, the big hub carriers, as opposed to other airlines that we think of as flying long haul.
Well, I mean, those big hub carriers are, you know, very large airlines, and they need the critical mass to operate. You can't, the challenge of a hub is you can't uncouple a couple of destinations in isolation. You know, it's an almost an all or nothing situation. You may be able to go from 3 waves to just 1 wave a day, or from 7 to 3, or something like that. But you need all of those connecting flows to make your networks work, and particularly in the cases of Qatar and Emirates and Etihad, where the local markets are still relatively small. I mean, Dubai has a much larger local market than it probably did 10 years ago, but you know, it's still relatively small, and the airlines rely on connecting traffic, so they have to operate to keep themselves in the game, and that's being helped as well in some respects by the cargo contributions that they're carrying on those flights. Whereas the European, you know, long haul carriers, people like Lufthansa and BA and KLM and Air France, have perhaps taken a more pragmatic view and are looking to operate with less frequency to see if they can stay in the market. But again, it's all about clarity and confidence. As soon as there, you know, as soon as there is more clarity, and there's a good question here from Adrian, which talks about, you know, the new World Tourism and Travel Council code and the EU's move on finding common practices to stimulate EU travel. Are they indicative of politicking rather than genuine action? Well, Adrian, I think, you know,
I think we know what John will say.
Yeah, what's the phrase? Actions speak louder than words. And there's been many books written by many politicians in the last couple of months. So I hope that answers that one for you. Peter makes a good comment here about RIP Hong Kong as a tourism destination as Cathay Pacific falls from the skies. Yes, it is horrible, isn't it, Peter? It's a tragic situation what's happening there, and of course Cathay and Hong Kong was impacted perhaps 6 months earlier by the civil unrest that precluded COVID-19. But you know, we've seen stories in the last couple of days of someone who wants to start a brand new airline in Hong Kong.
Yeah, Greater Bay Airlines, based in Hong Kong.
So, you know, and promising to take on board Cathay pilots and staff. So it's fascinating. And there is always opportunity out of this adversity. So, you know, there may be some winners. It's fascinating, and gosh, we do need a solution quickly.
So Hannah, John, we've got 2 minutes. Looking forward to 2021, what should tourism and businesses and people in hospitality, what should they be expecting? What are they planning for? Have you got any answers for them? Anything to help, I guess?
Well, yeah, Hannah, what would you do if you were in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think they've just got to be realistic at this point and predominantly focus on domestic markets and pivoting whatever you have to the domestic market, because even if borders reopen and there's a vaccine and everything else, it's still going to be a slow revival. So you've just got to get used to the fact that it's going to be domestic, and it's going to be domestic for at least another half year, I imagine.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, you know, until we break this vaccine code, it's gonna be really difficult. Bizarrely, despite all of the gloom, I think, you know, ultimately, and in a relatively short time frame, we could see some recovery, some quite significant recovery, but I don't expect an exponential or a straight line recovery back to 2019 levels. I think we're going to see some dips and some bumps along the way. You know, this is an aviation industry, and it's full of turbulence, and we're going to see that in the numbers, no doubt about that. Some places will open and close. I mean, as a tourism board, as a hotelier, I think it is about following the data and, you know, drawing some conclusions from the data. And that's not just about capacity, but that's about infection rates in various countries and what the trends are and what the movements are, and trying to overlay that with some good robust analysis about vaccines and when they will be available. But at the end of the day, until our aviation leaders find a common piece of ground around tracking, testing, and put a universal process in place, it is going to be a long journey back out of this.
Okay, well, we've come to the end of the webinar. Thank you both very much. Thanks for joining us, Hannah from Kale today, and thanks as always, John. We'll be back with another webinar in a month's time, so I think it's going to be December the 9th, Wednesday, December the 9th. In the meantime, do head over to the OAG website, where they've got an area that's giving you all the latest data on coronavirus, and has a recovery tracker and John's weekly blogs on the topic. There's plenty of information there to keep you up to date with what's happening. And I think that's all from us today. Have a good day.
Yeah,
Thanks very much. Thanks, John and Hannah.
Thanks, bye.